Okay, so hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us on this session on universal basic income and the job guarantee. My name is Jason, I'm an activist in London and I'll be chairing the panel. Universal basic income is an old idea, but that has been gaining increasing attention recently. The idea is that every citizen in society receives a flat monthly payment by government, regardless of whether they're working or not. The intention behind the payment is to provide enough to cover the basic cost of living and establish a sense of financial security for everyone. However, there are different ways to implement it, each with pros and cons. And here to discuss this, as well as the job guarantee, are our wonderful three speakers. First of all, just to remind you that this workshop is being recorded. So first, in part one, we have Antti Jauhiainen. Antti is an activist, author, and primary school teacher in Helsinki. He's co-founder of Parecon Finland, a think tank focused on participatory economy and democracy. He's the co-author of The Welfare State Strikes Back. And Antti will be talking about the Finnish UBI experiment and its results. Next, we have Peter Bohmer, who teaches political economy at the Evergreen State College and has been active in social movements since the late 1960s. Peter will be presenting competing versions of the UBI in the US, advocating for an inclusive and non-neoliberal UBI, and comparing and contrasting it to universal basic services. And then in part three, we'll have Shakuntala, who is an assistant professor in economics at the State University of New York, Potsdam. She's also a research scholar at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, USA, and she'll be talking about the job guarantee program in India. And then finally, we'll have around 30 to 40 minutes of discussion. So if you have a question, there are two ways. You can write your question directly into the chat, or if you'd like to ask it directly, please signal with a virtual hand. There's a chat icon under the reaction buttons and we can switch your camera on. So over to you, Antti.
Okay, very happy to be here. I'll share my notes and cross my fingers that everything works as it did when I tested this 3 minutes ago. Okay, seems to work, doesn't it? So my name is Antti Jauhiainen, and I'm co-founder of Parecon Finland, a think tank focused on democratic economy, democratic participatory economy, and ecological issues. I will be speaking mostly about Finnish basic income experiment today, based on 2 articles I've co-authored in the New York Times. I can post links to those after I've spoken, after my presentation. In these 2 articles, you can hear more about the situation a few years ago when the income experiment was starting and what possible flaws were in it. But today I'm presenting an overview of the basic income experiment that Finland conducted a few years ago. First important thing I want to talk about is that this is actually a very important experiment, despite the setbacks that I'm going to be also talking about today. It was the first nationwide statutory and randomized experiment on basic income in general. And this relates to welfare states, as I will come into. It's also important to note that this experiment was not universal. It was targeted at unemployed, and it originates from concerns of a conservative government to employ more people. The basic idea being that in Finland, there is a problem with very long-term unemployment, as well as demographic situation where there are less and less young people and lots of old people, which is sort of fiscally difficult situation because Finland also has very generous retirement benefits. And this has become more and more discussion in Finland lately. But I will not go into that too much today. But the conservative government was using sort of typical conservative tools to fix the situation, lowering taxes, punishing the unemployed. But part of that mix this time happened to be also this new trial on basic income, focused on unemployed, with possibly the hopes that that it would encourage people to pick up low-paying jobs and thus increase labor participation rate. I think it's important to note, and that's also one reason why this experiment came into being, is that Finland has a really long tradition of robust social research and university research. And the Social Insurance Institution of Finland actually had plans for over 10 years to conduct some research, either on universal basic income or just basic income targeted at unemployed. And these researchers and their teams had developed different plans for conducting this kind of nationwide statutory experiment in the hopes that it would yield important data on improving welfare in Finland. And the experiment that was conducted fell way short from the original outline. Key omissions being, of course, that it targeted only the unemployed, but also that the sample size was less than a fifth of what the researchers originally intended. The original plan, I think, was around 10,000 participants. Now it was 2,000. And also the amount of income that they received was now around 500 euros when it was planned to be over 700 euros. And I personally think that these omissions sort of show a bit what the aim of this particular experiment was. But despite these setbacks, it is still important to know that these kind of nationwide experiments are possible in Finland, and I hope that we'll see more of them in the future. The key findings for the Finnish basic income experiment, I've highlighted it. It's reliable income increases trust and happiness, and I think that cannot be overstated. Reliable income is such a key thing for people to build sustainable lives, in general, for themselves and their families. And this is also one of the sort of founding ideas for welfare states in general. But the results of this experiment again highlight this. The other findings relate a bit to the size and some of the limitations, that it was hard for the researchers to discern large differences in the target and the control group and those receiving basic income, not universal. And this experiment was conducted, and I think this is important for the global audience, that this particular experiment was conducted in a highly developed welfare state. Nordic countries being, I think, one of the most advanced welfare states ever. And we have robust income transfers, different means-tested benefits for all sorts of life situations, and also, very importantly, public services throughout the country, which are available to all, are mostly free, and which oftentimes even have a separate, if they have fees, they have separate systems so that the unemployed don't have to pay so much. Same applies, by the way, to national railways. Same applies to most of the museums and so on. And those receiving basic income during this experiment were also eligible for all those benefits targeted at unemployed. And this is important because this is, I think, also helps basic income projects and should always be mentioned when talking internationally about basic income schemes, because it really doesn't work at all without that whole network. I think it's part of that package. This is just a summary slide from the Social Security Insurance Security Institution of Finland, Kela, and you can check the numbers there. Also important is that the interpretation of the results of the basic income experiment is complicated by the introduction of the activation model in 2018. An activation model is a nice word for a very punitive unemployment scheme that the conservative government deployed coincidentally. I don't think it was planned, but coincidentally at the same time as the experiment, which the researchers found unfortunate because it came in middle of the basic income experiment, and therefore sort of created difficulties of discerning differences between the control group before the activation model and after the activation model. So I think the government a bit of a botched their own project, but the researchers kept working on. So that's the main result is in general that if you can count on receiving some income every month, year after year, as an unemployed person, it increases your trust in life and your happiness. But the important limitation for basic income experiment, also highlighted is in this experiment, was that life situations in general can vary so immensely that universal basic income, I think, is always relegated to sort of elementary support level. It can provide certain foundation, but it's no sort of, I don't think it's any sort of solution at all when we want to consider the whole network for the welfare state and beyond that into democratic economies. I think we will hear today more about public services and wage subsidy programs. As a sort of an irony, I wish to highlight that the left-wing government that came after the previous conservative government, the current Sanna Marin-headed social democratic government, has used public wage subsidy programs and managed to increase labor participation rate much more than the conservative government, which is sort of interesting that the conservative government's aim was to increase labor participation rate. But what they managed to do was just sort of beat the unemployed into submission. And now public wage subsidy programs, as well as ending, for example, the punitive activation model, seem to have had a positive effect on labor participation rate. So that's sort of the technical outline of the Finnish basic income experiment. And maybe I can add something more in a question and answer session, but I wanted to end my my presentation, to talking a bit more about why these experiments are important. I think social sciences in general would benefit hugely if these kind of ambitious and innovative programs, innovative and sort of real life experiments could be conducted. And what better place to do them than the current welfare states, which already have a great system for tracking even individual income. Finland just last year introduced this real-time tax system, which allows, for example, tax rate to be changed on a monthly basis in real time without filling any tax forms or anything, so that we have now a system in place to do, for example, if a person becomes unemployed, to change their tax level in almost real time. And I think all sorts of social policy experiments could be directed towards public benefits and services and open discussion on new alternatives. And of course, what I favor, radical thinking on alternatives. And this is something that I don't think can happen without government funding. And therefore, I think those governments that wish to deploy innovative policies for the future should be prepared to offer long-term tracking for results of this kind of research and funding for various different scale programs. Examples I could come up with is different basic income systems targeted at vulnerable groups, or public service systems, or for example, job guarantee programs. And of course, as an anti-capitalist myself, I wish to highlight that universal basic income is an important tool for combating the inherent flaws of our current economic system. And I think open discussion, open public discussion, that these are all sort of welfare state policies and these kind of support systems are required because of the flaws in our economic system. It's a story that has repeated itself every time since the sort of invention of modern capitalism. And it just helps the public discussion if we are open about it and sort of inform the audience that this is the reason why we need to have all sorts of support systems, and why I personally think that discussion on alternatives is needed. I mean, alternatives to capitalism. So that's where I think I'm going to stop. And that's my quick outline of the Finnish basic income experiment. I can sort of tell more on the background or something on the results, but ultimately it ended up being a very small scale program with hopefully the kind of data that can inform future experiments. But I hope Finland will see more of these kind of experiments, although currently it seems like nothing on the scale of even this limited experiment is upcoming. But yes, thank you, and Jason, you're free to take the reins after me.
Okay, thank you very much, Antti. Next we have Peter, and I'll get your slides up now.
Oh, thank you, Jason. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
I
great.
think you're good.
Okay, I'll start then. Hi, this is Pete Bohmer, Olympia, Washington. And in my presentation, I'll explain how a substantive and non-neoliberal universal basic income, or UBI, could substantially improve people's lives, is feasible and possible, and can be a step toward a revolutionary transformation of society towards participatory socialism. There is no conflict with related proposals for universal basic services at UBS or guaranteed jobs. Okay, by UBI, I'm referring to a policy where every resident of society is guaranteed an income sufficient to meet basic needs. This includes immigrants, documented and undocumented, and those incarcerated, a major issue in the United States. I'll focus on the US, although it's important to conceptualize the UBI globally. So to me, there are two broad versions of the UBI. There's a non-reformist proposal, which I'm going to advocate for, as opposed to a neoliberal version. Okay, so in the non-reformist, I call a radical reform UBI, everyone has an income above the poverty level to meet basic needs. So an example of the non-reformist proposal, although not fully developed, is that proposed by U.S. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. It's called the Support Act, introduced in 2021. And supposed to go into effect if passed in 2028. It would give $1,200 per adult per month and $600 per month for those under 18. So a family of one adult and two kids would receive $2,400 a month or $28,800 a year in cash. In Ilhan Omar's proposal, there's an income cutoff where the top 5% of the income distribution would not be eligible. I prefer no income cutoff, but instead high tax on wealthy people. So these new taxes, their additional tax payments would be substantially higher than what they receive in the UBI. A program that is universal, such as Social Security and Medicare in the US, may be easier to win and maintain support for than one that's means tested. In addition, the UBI would be adjusted upwards every year for inflation. If prices went up by 5% in the first year, the UBI for an adult would go up to $1,260 a month. In this more radical version of the UBI, which public programs would continue in addition to the UBI? So to me, a principle is basic public services, which should be universal and free, and special needs will continue. They should be publicly financed in addition to UBI. Also, social insurance programs should continue. So, for example, this means child care or child care credits, health care, elder and disability care, Social Security, public housing and housing subsidies such as Section 8, scholarship for college students and a free tuition, unemployment insurance, all those will continue and be improved. However, various cash grants or near cash grants that exist for low-income people and are inadequate could end because of the high level of income provided by this adequate UBI. So temporary aid to needy families, TANF, often called welfare, the earned income tax credit, food stamps could be eliminated as they'd be more than covered by the UBI. What about Social Security disability, which is a big program in the US? As long as we don't have extensive and inclusive and free healthcare, SSI should continue, especially because of the limitations of most disabled people to work full-time for wages. Okay, so again, what about a reformist versus a non-reformist UBI? The reformist version of UBI, going back to Milton Friedman's negative income tax proposal from almost 60 years ago, many of polls such by Andrew Yang, a presidential candidate, and many of the Silicon Valley corporate sponsors propose to support a UBI as a substitute for social programs rather than proposals such as mine, the Support Act, which sees UBI in addition to many of the needed social programs such as child care and elder care, education, etc. UBI proposals that replace needed social programs should not be supported. By non-reformist reforms are ones that improve people's lives, cannot be fully achieved in a capitalist society, build social consciousness and capacity to make further demands. See the really important book by Andre Gortz from 1960, Strategies for Labor, which develops this idea of non-reformist reforms. A non-reformist UBI type program also has a long history. For example, the guaranteed incomes of the National Welfare Rights Organization in 1960 for $6,500 for a family of four, which is equivalent to over $50,000 a year using today's prices. Martin Luther King's 1968 Poor People's Campaign also demanded an above poverty line guaranteed income. So let me turn now to the strength of the what I call the non-reformist radical reform UBI, which is somewhat, quite a bit different from what Antti was talking about in the first presentation. So these to me is some of the strength. It's poverty. To me, I call it the right not to be poor, a human right to have one's basic needs met. The amount proposed means a family of two adults and two children receive $43,200 per year, well below the median income of the US, but with the continuation and expansion of social programs such as health care for all, Medicare for all, could mean an income above the poverty line for all, a significant achievement. Inequality of income, B, would be significantly reduced. The gross cost of this program is substantial, be about 20% of GDP. If the taxes to finance this major program came from higher income people, the income of the poor half of the population, those below median income, would approximately double their income and their share of income. So a major increase in inequality. Okay, C, waged work. For the UBI, unlike many social welfare programs, there's no work requirement. Because the income one receives is still low, $14,400 for single person, 18 and over, most people will still want to work. With the UBI, one's income increases as people work, as they still receive the UBI. Wages for low-wage jobs especially will increase. The major determinant of wages in a capitalist society is the relative bargaining power of workers vis-a-vis their employers. The bargaining power of workers are increased when they're better organized, when they have alternatives to wage labor such as UBI, when unemployment decreases, when demand for the labor increases relative to supply, and if the skills are scarce. With the UBI, such as we've been discussing, workers will still have the income to survive if they do not find a somewhat desirable job. This will force employers to raise wages and improve work conditions to attract workers in low-paying and poor jobs. In addition, if some employees withdraw from seeking employment because of the UBI, this will reduce supply of workers, which will also cause employers to raise wages. Like the recent increase of unemployment benefits during the COVID-19 pandemic, the UBI will give the unemployed income so they don't have to take the first job offered and be able to search for better jobs after receiving the UBI. It is likely their economic well-being has increased if they choose not to do minimum wage work unless the wage for these jobs increase. So it gives, again, people the chance to say no for jobs. Similarly, the UBI will increase workers' ability to demand and win better work conditions, less dangerous and healthier work, and less speed up as they have the fallback of the UBI if employers don't improve the quality of work. The UBI is a radical non-reformist reform because it will decrease the power of employers over workers because the fear of being unemployed is somewhat reduced with this guaranteed income. Okay, next about work, meaningful work. A few years ago, about 3 years ago, I was doing a workshop on the UBI to a group of artists. Most had low-wage jobs so they could support their passion for poetry, music, creative writing, etc. The majority of this group said they would quit their low-wage job immediately, which the universally dislike, to be full-time artists if there was UBI. So people would have more opportunity to do what they'd like to do. Similarly, volunteer work in social justice organizations and organizing activism would become more possible with this UBI above the poverty line. Organizations become less dependent on rich funders if more of the work can be done by volunteers who are receiving UBI. For example, the more generous welfare state in the US of the late 60s and 1970s than today made it easier for activists to survive and organizations to rely less on paid staff for work that needed to be done. The UBI would make it possible for workers to work less hours at one rather than two jobs, leaving more time for volunteer work, rest and recreation, and community building. D, household labor, reproductive labor, wage for housework. The UBI would make it easier for women to leave abusive relationships as they will still receive the UBI. There are some similarities to the movement that began in Italy in the 1970s, wage for housework. The UBI would give an income to non-wage labor done at the home. This would increase women's power to demand household labor be evenly distributed among household members. It would make it more possible to leave situations or partners who refuse to do their share of housework because of the basic income these women and others who do most of the houseworks would have. Next, racial justice equity. Although everyone receives the UBI because of progressive taxes to finance the UBI, see my next point, the net benefit, which is basically UBI minus increased taxes, will go to the lower 80% of the income distribution, and most of it to those who make less than the median income. Because of continued racism in the US, Blacks, Latinx, and American Indians are disproportionately overrepresented in this part of the income distribution, and therefore will benefit greatly, more than their proportion in the population. Moreover, this proposal for an inclusive UBI would include all immigrants. Immigrants today are mainly people of color. Similarly, would include prisoners, almost 2/3 of whom are Black, Latinx, Native American, and Asian and Pacific Islander. It would significantly help inmates when they're released to have some savings from the UBI they've saved and also an income as they're searching for work. Let me emphasize, I'm examining UBI that provides an income above the poverty line that is an addition to and not a substitute for needed social programs. Healthcare, childcare, housing, education should also be expanded. This proposal includes, as I've said, the entire population, including immigrants and the incarcerated. Many of the strength of this non-reformist UBI do not apply to what I'm calling a neoliberal UBI, one that replaced many of the social programs we have, even though they're so inadequate. This proposed UBI is expensive but economically feasible. The question is, can we develop the power from below to substantially change the unjust income distribution in the United States and other countries organizing for UBI? Okay. Financing the UBI. A UBI is costly. If we get rid of the few cash programs I mentioned, include a housing subsidy for high housing cost cities, the total cost of this program is about $4 trillion, almost 20% of US GDP. Substantial decrease in military spending could pay part of this cost, but unless we increase deficit spending, most of the UBI must be financed by higher taxes. If this program is to be truly redistributive, we need a new highly progressive tax on the income and on wealth to finance it. If we include capital gains and other forms of property income, the top 1% in the US has about 20% of national income, and the top 10% has about 50% of national income, and the top 40% has about 80% of national income. So additional tax that began at 10% of income above the median income to a surtax on 40% on the highest income top 1% could pay for the UBI. Increasing a progressive tax on wealth or a combination of income and wealth tax could raise the required financing. I'll put my email in the chat so if people want to text these notes. What about inflation? If financed by higher tax on high-income people, the direct inflationary effect is likely to be minimal. If aggregate demand, however, increases somewhat because of the more equal distribution of income, fiscal and monetary policy could be used to reduce inflationary pressures. So this UBI is economically feasible, but the resistance by high-income people will be intense. Okay, winning the UBI. We will not win this type of UBI program in the immediate future. A feasible and good idea is not sufficient. We need to do popular education to explain it, which builds on a philosophy that it's a basic right for each human being to have their basic needs met. And the idea that would be more, of course, established in a socialist society. The UBI is the embodiment of the value that income doesn't have to be tied to making profits for somebody else. We're not starting from scratch. There is increasing interest in the idea in some of the socialist, in some groups like the socialist groups in the US, like DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, the COVID-19 pandemic increased the legitimacy of a guaranteed income for all. A successful movement for the UBI would have to be connected to other social movements. For example, it should connect issues of anti-racism and women's equality, as poverty disproportionately affects women, and of course connect with Latinx, Native American, and Black people's social movements. The UBI would disproportionately benefit people of color and women of all racial groups. Building support for the UBI from community groups is essential. Hopefully some unions will support the UBI as it makes strikes more possible, as striking workers could use the UBI as a strike fund. Explaining the UBI in the alternate social media and organizing good coverage of it in the mainstream media is important. So doing popular education, debating the UBI is the first step. It seems possible to win a UBI on an experimental level, first in certain communities and having the UBI in a few cities or in a state like California. It's already happening in a limited level in Stockton, LA, and other places. By developing a campaign for the UBI, it could happen first in some cities and then some states, leading to a national discussion and campaign. The financing of it would be difficult on a less than national level because tax and high income people would substantially increase the pay for it, and the high income and wealthy could threaten to and might actually move their local or state tax increase substantially to fund this UBI. It should be the UBI should be one part of an anti-capitalist program as strategy as it puts forward in part the principle that income should be determined by need. There's also a growing interest by several corporate leaders, for example, in Silicon Valley, which is important to build coalitions for it, but we must struggle so it's not a version that further guts social programs. The argument in favor of moderate beginning UBI is that it be a step towards the kind of program others and I are proposing. If the minimal version of the UBI was the goal and endpoint, it'd be a reformist program. But although it may be better than we have now, it'd be totally inadequate and wouldn't end or substantially reduce poverty. This is especially true with ended programs such as WIC, unemployment insurance, reduced to free school lunches, which has been proposed. So the details of the UBI, what kind really matter. We should organize and advocate for universal basic income like the one I've been explaining. Okay. Let me make two final comments in closing. One, in a lot of the experiments around the UBI, a very big claim is that the UBI would increase, employment or labor force participation rate. Antti referred to this in the Finnish case. And my point is that's the wrong question to ask. If people have the UBI and, work less, refuse to take low-wage jobs, if that adds to their happiness, fine. So I would argue this idea about saying, does it increase employment, is the wrong question to ask. I think what Antti was talking, does it increase happiness and human well-being, is the right question to ask. And that may be done by working less hours, not working, and living on the UBI if the alternatives are really kind of low-wage and shitty jobs. Okay, finally, my last comment about universal basic services. Okay, UBS, sometimes proposed as an alternative to the UBI is the idea of universal basic services. The UBS, or universal basic services, fits well into a major theme of this conference, as the idea is that basic services are taken out of the market. They are decommodified and financed out of general revenues rather than paid for by individuals. Usually included part of UBS are healthcare, education, childcare and elder care, public transportation, and communication, usually internet connectivity. I would also include food and housing as basic services, or they're not always included. These universal basic services could be produced by some level of the government, local, state, federal, and US, or by nonprofits, by cooperatives, and a few cases regulated for-profit business, all financed by public revenues. Although there's been less discussion of universal basic services, focus on universality, decommodification, and reproductive and caring labor is very promising. To me, the UBS, the Universal Basic Service, and UBI are complementary. They fit well together. Both meet human needs, and some combination of the two is a step towards a participatory socialist alternative to capitalism. Si se puede. Thank you. And that's, I'm finished with my presentation. So, Jason, give back to you, and I was making it to Shakuntala.
Yes, great. Perfect timing. Okay, thank you, Peter. Yes, next I'm happy to welcome Shakuntala, who will be talking about the job guarantee in India. I'll just get your slides up.
Greetings, everyone. I'm sorry my video seems to not working. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
I am audible, okay. So I'll have to go with that.
Okay, just let me know when you'd like to move to the next slide, okay?
Oh, sure, thank you.
Okay, over to you.
Hi, good evening. Here I'm in India, so it's good evening, and wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon. So what I'll be talking about is the job guarantee program that India has implemented, which is called the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. And I'll share about the Indian experience, 16 years since it was implemented. So give you a broad overview of how the implementation has happened on the ground. Not going into too much detail state-wise, but it's a national overview that I'll be talking about. Okay, slide 1, please. Next slide, please. So, okay. Right. So the Government of India enacted the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in 2005 with the objective of producing a well-designed wage employment program to address poverty more effectively. In 2009, the Act was renamed Mahatma Gandhi NREGA, National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which aimed at enhancing the livelihood security of the rural poor by providing at least 100 days of guaranteed employment in a financial year to every rural household whose adult members are willing to do unskilled manual work. Next slide, please. So the Act, this is a legislation, a rights-based Act. This was implemented in 3 phases. The entire program was implemented in 3 phases. It was initiated first in the 200 most backward, I will use the word quote-unquote, backward districts of the country in phase 1, 2006 and 7. In phase 2, it was extended to an additional 130 districts, 2007 and 8, and from 2000 onward, it has been extended to all the remaining rural districts. This is a huge, it's currently the largest funded rural development program in India, with an annual budget of USD 8.4 billion in 2019-20, compared to an initial budget of 1.6 billion in 2006 and 7. MGNREA is operational in 34 out of the 36 states and union territories and 691 of the 712 districts, which includes 6,918 blocks and 2,62,432 gram panchayats, or the village council, village institution, the lowest tier of the local government system in India. It is the largest public employment program in the world, employing 52 million people and creating 2.34 billion person days of work in 2017-18. 128.5 million rural households are registered in the scheme, and they're eligible to work for work on demand. They have to demand that work, and which this represents 38.85% of India's rural population. Next slide, please. So India has a long history of implementing public work and food security programs directed towards poverty alleviation and famine relief measures. However, the introduction of MGNREA in 2006 marked a fundamental policy shift from the provision of rural employment work to a legislatively backed 100-day employment guarantee. This program provides all rural Indian households with an entitlement to demand for up to 100 days of work at any time each year. The implication of the demand-driven and right-based nature of the program means that the scale of employment provision must be significant relative to the scale of demand and made available nationally. So this is a town-bound action to fulfill the guarantee. The incentive structure, center funds the program 75% and the state funds 25% the cost, and the state is responsible for providing any unemployment allowance in case it fails to provide employment within 15 days of applying for the job. Demand-based resource availability and accountability of public delivery system is built into the system. Next slide, please. So the permissible works that we can see under the program are all related to environmentally, the green jobs we talk about, so soil conservation, water conservation, land development, rural roads, it's all connected to rural development, and any other work which may be notified by the central government. And in consultation with the state government. So what it shows that even though this is a program funded, major funding coming from the central federal government, the state has a complete kind of freedom and levels of implementation. I'll show where there is enough scope for participatory democracy and expanding democracy within the provisions of this Employment Guarantee Act. Next slide, please. So the objectives of the Act, as mentioned in the article, are enhancing livelihood security, fostering social equity, generating productive assets within the, as required locally, protecting the environment, empowering rural women, and reducing rural-urban migration. Several studies have looked at, micro-level studies, several studies have looked at each one of these issues very carefully, and what I'm going to talk about is again a macro-level finding. So next slide, please. So you can see here the levels of implementation. It's coming from the central government. Ministry of Rural Development is responsible, and then it goes the three lowest tiers, which comprises Panchayat Raj institutions. This is where it happens at the village level, and the village council and the village communities are responsible for coming up with projects that help the communities in terms of sustainable development, in terms of making village self-sufficient. So even though it's a center funded, it has a more decentralized planning and implementation process embedded into the system. So next slide, please. Effectively, this is the 16th year of operation, and program website provides real-time data on a large number of parameters associated with implementation. Assets created have since been geotagged with before and after pictures, provisions for twice-a-year social benefits, where people audit the program that involve public verification of master rolls, that is the attendance sheets, and other expenditure in village council. And this can involve workers and other civil society organizations. This allows not just an important feedback and accountability, but also provides another platform for civil society to engage with the program. It is very easy to see that MGNREA is very complex, designed to achieve a number of goals at once, demanding close coordination across departments and layers of administration. Successful implementation thus depends crucially on staff capacity at various levels. Thus, although the program has a national character, it varies substantially across states in the effectiveness of implementation. Despite numerous hurdles, the NREGA has achieved significant breakthroughs in addressing deprivation. The larger contribution of the program as a focal point for organizing around the rights of rural workers and its capacity for transformative politics is hard to overlook and is particularly relevant issue in current times. So the major positive trends, what we find here, migration is, to a huge extent, migration has been reduced. I'll talk about in a while about the women's, how one of the unintended consequences of the program has been huge participation of women in the program. Most families have a job card. Job card is, you have to, in order to apply for the program, you have to have the job card. So awareness level have gone up and minimum wages being paid. So that is a very positive one. Implication. And contractors, private contractors had been a big abuse in rural India. in terms of getting minimum wages, in terms of getting employment and all that. So contractors have disappeared in many places, private contractors. And most of the work, as data now shows, that may not be in the initial years, but now most of the works are productive work. It is not just digging holes and filling them up. As was kind of, in order to scrape the program, this kind of, this was mentioned even by World Bank study in the initial years, 2007 and 8, but now they have mentioned that this is a stellar of a development program in India. So when work is available, and this is a lifeline for the poor. Slide, next slide, please. Now, data at the country level suggests that a majority of workers on the program are women, accounting consistently for around 52% on average since inception. These rates have been fairly stable over time and much higher than the mandated 1/3. It was 1/3 of the women, 1/3 of the workforce has to be women. That was mandatory from the beginning. In states such as Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Rajasthan, and Andhra Pradesh, and Telangana, it is well above the national average. The proportion of women in the total rural workforce is 34.9%, according to the census of 2011. Their representation in the program is 52% on average for 2010-2012, suggesting that the program is drawing more women than men to work sites. In 2011-12, as per the NSS data at the all India level, in 20% of the rural households who worked on MGNREA work sites, only the female member participated, indicating that the program provides a household level entitlement that allows women to take advantage of the opportunity. So why are women attracted to the program? This relates to the problems associated with the existing employment opportunities, especially for women. There are very few opportunities in private labor market in the rural area for women. There are irregularly paid work, hazardous work with impossibility of injury. Work involves migration, and that involves a whole list of other issues and vulnerabilities. A number of reasons have been identified for women preferring to work in the program. The wages typically exceed what women get in private work, especially on farm or in unskilled non-farm work. This attracts women to work sites. For many men, the wages are lower than what they can earn outside and tend to prefer the latter. However, apart from this, the proximity to work sites is another important factor. In many areas in states such as Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu, women work on MGNREA work sites in the morning and tend to their own farms in the evening. In the absence of the program, they would not have worked at all because no work is available locally, or they would have to work a full day outside the village. This is also very unattractive. This is also an attractive feature for women. Several states have used MGNREA to provide work for the differently abled and the elderly. In the initial years, only a few states have specific guidelines in place, but too soon, many states followed. These states include Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Tripura, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, and West Bengal. Activities such as drinking water arrangements, looking after children, irrigation, canal digging, earth backfiling, sprinkling water on newly built walls, filling sand and pebbles in pans, etc., have been suggested to the differently abled people. Some states have conducted detailed time and motion studies to design work for this particularly vulnerable group. It is hard to overstate the transformative impact of such opportunities for both the disabled and the elderly, especially when in most states, pensions and support for the disabled remain pitifully low. Next slide, please. In terms of benefit, if we look at the NRG assessment, it has been that very effective in generating work, increasing income, consumption expenditure, filling an important need for rural adults during the lean season and in times of shocks, and especially so for the Dalits and tribal people or Adivasis. The findings on migration suggest that the program deters short-term distress migration, but not yet long-term migration. A number of field studies emphasize the importance of these earnings to workers, helping them to avoid hunger, improve food security, cope with illness, avoid migration, sending children to school, avoid hazardous or demeaning work. In a study from Worksite in Tamil Nadu covering 102 women, it was evident that the wages women earned as NRGA workers enabled them to accomplish a number of things, ranging from paying their debts or retrieving pawned gold to spending on children's health and education or saving chip funds, apart from meeting day-to-day household expenses. And another a very important, the final thing, the financial inclusion, apparent benefit has been the financial inclusion. In 2009, when it was mandated that wage payments be routed through banks or post offices, this did put heavy pressure on the banking system and resulted in delays and inconvenience to workers. But it also connected workers to the formal banking system. An estimated 9 crore bank accounts and 2.3 crores post office were opened around this time. Relatedly, with individual workers getting paid directly into the accounts, women could now access their wages via their own bank accounts. A recent paper suggests that when women are trained to use these accounts, it seems to enhance their agency and power within the household and changes gendered norms regarding their work status, increasing acceptance of working women. And last slide, please. So the road ahead, it's a checkered implementation. We need to introduce, not only introduce, there has always been provision, but the problem lies in the implementation. There has to be a training component added to the program, which is incentive-based schemes, so that the village level self-sufficiency grows, that the people who are working in these assets, they have a control and they have ownership of these assets. So that's kind of training aspect. It's a right-based program. So how is that right framework actually gets implemented on the ground? What we have seen is the group right rather than individual right that is more successful. Timely wage payment because they depend during the lean season. This is the only source of income. So if wage payments are not done timely, then it's not only not incentive, but completely fails the purpose. Decentralized planning and devolution of resources. Here is immense scope for expanding democracy and giving power at the local hands. But it needs to be done more in a much more planned manner with the available resources. Shelf of work needs to be evolved with greater active public participation. Community development needs to be emphasized more, and continuous awareness and mass mobilization. One thing that I have not mentioned here is about the funding of the program and the problems associated with that. Even if we go with the sound finance, quote unquote, sound finance approach to funding this program, it is only 0.33% of GDP, less than 1% of GDP. And if we go by the modern money approach, India being a sovereign government with a floating exchange rate can absolutely fund this program. It does not have any the constraints that it has is self-imposed constraint. So financial constraint, there is no financial constraint. Resource constraint, it's shown that there are not enough work available. That is also, planning needs to be done more carefully to show that enough resources, well, labor is the most important resource, so mobilization of that resource, and then what work can be available to make these villages self-sufficient needs to pay attention. More attention needs to be given that respect. Okay, so I will stop here.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We've heard 3 very interesting and informative presentations. Now we have about half an hour left for questions and answers. So if you can see the Q&A tab on the right of the screen, if anyone has a question they'd like to put to the speakers, please go ahead and write it in there. Or if you'd like to ask it in person, then we can also switch your camera on. So while we're waiting for people to write some questions, do the panelists have any questions or comments or reactions they'd like to make to any of the other speakers? If you do, then have a think about that and raise your finger and I can point to you. Otherwise, I could ask a question. Okay, so one of the things with UBI is that it's important. What's important is the actual amount that is set. It needs to be high enough to make a meaningful impact to people's lives. And the issue is that with that, as you've said, Peter, is that this is expensive. And that means that the higher income and the wealthy of society will need to share a large burden of that to finance a UBI. And that's always going to be the challenge. And that the only way that we can see UBIs emerging would be ones that then take away from public services, which is the right agenda. So have you got any thoughts about that inherent kind of challenge with advancing the UBI?
Yeah, so I'll start. Maybe Antti, you want to answer Shakuntala too. So, I mean, I think you summarized very well what I was trying to say. And, you know, I'm arguing, I said the kind of UBI that really would be significant is about 20% of national income or GDP. So again, you know, given the income of high income people, let's say that 10% of the population that has 50% of income, certainly they would still have a lot, even if there was a UBI. So again, to me, the question is, can we build the political power, which we don't have now, to really make this a demand that doesn't cut social programs, that isn't, for example, some of the experiments now of $500 a month for adults, $6,000 a year, which to me is totally inadequate. And so it's really a struggle. I think a question becomes, what if we have a more moderate UBI, like California, like LA, and some cities are beginning that? Can we see that as a step toward a more significant one? Like, again, I was thinking of the Obamacare, which is so inadequate, so much bills in the insurance companies, but maybe it begins to legitimize the idea of healthcare for all so we can move forward. So I don't know, I think the question is really the question of, can we build that power? And we don't have it now, but again, I try to argue of really including the UBI together with other issues, not seeing it in separation. So I still think it's a worthwhile thing to work on, even given the constraints you mentioned. Okay, now we can see everybody.
Yes, your camera seems to be working now,
Good.
Shakuntala, so great. Yeah, any other comments on that? Or there is a question in the Q&A.
I can
read.
Okay, yeah. Please go ahead. Yes.
Oh. Yep, okay. So Thomas is asking, what aspects of domination does a UBI always have? And does it have any? Is that clear to everyone, or Thomas, would you like to perhaps clarify what you mean a bit by domination? Okay. Okay. While Thomas is thinking about that, we can come back to that, unless somebody wants to. Thomas.
Hi.
Please go ahead and ask your question. We can't hear you. Is your microphone on? Okay, try now. Sorry, we still can't hear you, Thomas.
Maybe, Thomas, you could write more in the chat.
Okay, well, Thomas is trying to organize that.
I have a question.
Maybe, yep, go ahead, Peter.
For Shakuntala. So, about the program you're discussing, with the current very anti-Muslim BJP, the Modi government, have you looked into that in terms of which communities get it? Is there discrimination toward Muslim, other non Hindu communities in terms of which communities are receiving the rural aid, the rural employment program? You're muted. Okay. You're muted. Can you? Okay.
Shakuntala, I'm afraid we can't hear you. You seem to be muted. It's the microphone button.
Below.
There we
Okay.
go.
Nope, no.
Try again. You had it unmuted for a second there. Okay. We can hear you. Go ahead.
You can hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So it has drawn large number of people from the backward, so-called scheduled the caste system in India, the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, a huge number of participation of these people from these groups, and a huge participation of tribal Adivasis, Dalits, huge participation. That has happened, and that trend has been right from the very beginning. And so in terms of, there are several factors there, the village level. Sometimes these people do not get job at private households, and so a program like this, especially during their lean season, has been able to draw people, more workers from these groups. So huge participation of workers from these groups. That is sometimes being overlooked when economists and policymakers especially try to provide the argument. The most common argument coming from the right wing is the corruption and the cost, the huge cost. And that's what my paper is. I'm working on that. A chapter of my dissertation is also showing that even if you go by fiscal sound finance, it's less than 2% of GDP. If you go for even for 200 and more than 100 days, so even if it's 274 days, that was the initial in the citizens draft. That was what was demanded. Even with that estimate, it is less than 2% GDP. So you cannot make that argument about the cost part, and of course fiscal deficit, and it's no way that stands that argument. And the corruption, you need to tackle that. And there are several provisions in the Act. Instead of scraping the entire program, there are several provisions in the Act that speak to accountability and governance mechanism, to strengthening, instead of putting resources to strengthen that, scraping off the program is not at all a solution.
I could briefly mention regarding the cost of basic income programs is that one change we've had in recent decades in basically all countries of the world, especially in the United States, is the share of capital income of the nation's economy. And capital income, I think it's sort of interesting to always mention it when we're discussing universal basic income, because capital income is something you receive regardless of what you do, and you sort of receive it as a steady income, and it is constantly being given off, even though you don't work anything for it. Others work for you. And that income, I think, is over 5 trillion. I think the share of capital income is currently in the United States over 5 trillion per year. Half of, we can come up with percentages, but I think, starting there, that's one point in the funding discussion of universal basic income, that, having discussion on what has happened there in regards to capital income. Not sure if Thomas can get his microphone working, but whenever it comes to discussion on any sort of state-directed programs, such as universal basic income, it's a relevant point that there is always the aspect of domination, as there is, I think we have to be honest about it whenever we are discussing in a philosophical sense any sort of, nationwide policies and so on. There is, domination of some form present. The most famous of which I think is the term that libertarians use, right-wing libertarians use, which is that taxation is theft. That's a funny way to put it, but when it comes to sort of domination and so on, that's just present with, everything we do in a big society. We just have to come up with ways that are, wise and preferably as democratic as possible, and one that can be, reopened and discussed further. So I think universal basic income in that spectrum falls on the very no domination side. Although, for example, if it would be funded through capital income transfers, then, perhaps it would have domination towards the rich, but I think that is beneficial in many ways.
Okay, we have a question I can see in the chat by Sylvie, who's asking, the USA is still unable to implement a coherent health system, and recent history has shown how this struggle has been very intense. So how can we reasonably affirm that UBI could be implemented with a whole range of public services while taking in account this political background? Antti, go ahead.
This is my worry as well, and this is something I sort of tried to bring out in my presentation. It is sort of curious to me as a citizen living in a country which has had, for example, all sorts of, public schooling, free university for all, wide, support networks for child benefit systems. We've had those for over 50 years. We've had child support systems since I think the end of the 40s, when free child benefit programs started, and we've run them ever since. And United States is really backwards in that regard. And I think reaching out to universal basic income, which has it generates, it's an interesting discussion. It has a lot of, details that need to be worked out, and I think it can provide important steps towards a fair economy. But I think it's something that more advanced welfare states, such as the Nordic countries, can work on, whilst I hope United States will sort of finally start picking the really low-hanging fruit, such as, coherent public health system and hopefully fair benefit systems.
Yep, Peter.
To add to what Antti said, yeah, I don't see it in the U.S. as a victory in the short run for sure, and maybe seeing it take place in other countries would increase the likelihood here. I was trying to suggest in my talk, we really need a long-run strategy and a movement-based strategy. Just having these great ideas about a UPI, I think means, almost nothing given the whole kind of neoliberal hegemony in the United States about, taxes are, like you're saying, is somehow theft from, people who are making a lot of money. So that's why I try to stress the kind of popular education. And even though, and I mentioned this yesterday, I think, the pandemic on the one hand has really weakened social movements of people getting together, a lot of individualistic behavior. But on the other hand, ideas of a guaranteed income, that the right to live in this period of the pandemic, I think just like for universal health care, the support for those, at least from polls I've seen, people I've talked to, has really increased. So again, that's a thin positive point, but it's a very, very uphill struggle.
Okay, I have a question actually for Shakuntala.
Yes.
Around the job guarantee, which is one of the, one of the concerns that's been leveled against the job guarantee is that when the state steps in and offers jobs, these can then compete with the private sector at competition. And this is, the private sector obviously is not very happy about that. Has that been an issue in any way in India, and how has it been overcome?
Well, this is manual unskilled labor, unskilled work. We are emphasizing to add the training component to it, but that hasn't happened on a large scale. What has happened is, yes, it is putting pressure on the agricultural wage or the private labor market. Because the wage is the minimum wage in the region. So you do not have a uniform wage across India. So different states have different agricultural wage, so minimum agricultural wage. So what is happening when these workers are getting a guaranteed wage for, let's say, 100 days, close to 100 days, if there is that kind of a security, then there is a bargaining power also, what we see among the private capitalist landlords hiring all these workers. So there is an upward pressure, and we have seen resistance from landlords, rural landlords, against the program in the name of corruption, in the name of so yes, private labor market, there has been an upward pressure on wages. But not so much. In order to have that on a sustained level, you have to have a sustained level of employment. So that hasn't happened. It has been extremely erratic, kind of. If you look at even now during the pandemic, most states that have done very well, like Rajasthan, close to 75 days of employment. So in order to have that pressure, or in order to have that bargaining power, you have to have a high level of number of days of employment. So that hasn't happened across states. 45, 50 number of days per year. So 1.5 months mostly.
Okay, thank you. Right, I can see some activity in the chat feed, but if anyone has a specific question they'd like to put forward, please could you write it in the Q&A tab. We have about 9 minutes left. Otherwise, I will ask our speakers for some final closing remarks, and then we can wrap up. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and write them in the Q&A tab. Otherwise, Otherwise, okay. Yeah, would everyone then like to make a kind of a 1 minute final closing statement before we end the session? So, Antti, would you like to go first?
Okay, just briefly that I think Panayotis made a great comment on the chat about the practice of these ideas. And I think that is that I've been very impressed by the whole the Democratizing Work conference. And I hope this platform will continue in the future, especially towards ideas on how to work towards more democratic society and more democratic economy in various forms, and finally bringing that discussion into focus, which I think is hugely important both for work as well as actually for climate. And I've seen there are interesting discussions on climate and environment also as part of Democratizing Work conference. But I just want to thank the audience and my fellow panelists. Immensely interesting to hear these points, and I hope we see more research and action towards fairer society in the future.
Great, thanks, Antti. Shakuntala, would you like to go next?
There is you have seen that Thomas has put this question. I meant,
okay, yes.
could the UBI have aspects to calm people down, or is it really intended to empower people? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if either of you would like to sort of address that when you're in your final statement.
I couldn't hear Shakuntala. Could you repeat that again? I couldn't.
Yeah, this
sound.
Is the, Thomas. I meant what he said. Repeat it. I meant, could the UBI have aspects to calm people down, or is it really intended to empower people? That was the question.
Okay, so yeah, I'll try to include that in my brief comments. Yeah, so again, like Antti, I want to thank the other panelists, Jason again for helping do all this work with the slides, and also people for taking part. So in my closing comments, yeah, so I think from the top, what I call this neoliberal Silicon Valley version, Andrew Yang, who ran for president, I think it really is a way, it's kind of a libertarian response to the kind of growing inequality of income, fears of automation, unemployment, etc. And it's not about empowering people, okay? On the other hand, what I was trying to argue, if I call it the non-reformist or radical reform UBI, I see it as a long-run struggle, but part of the struggle for revolutionary transformation of society for what I call participatory socialism, that by legitimizing this idea of income should be turned by people's need, not by how much capital they have. Stuff like Antti was talking, it's almost 40% of U.S. national income now is capital income. So the idea that income should be done by need, and also such a large part of capitalism has been the reserve army, the unemployment, the Shakuntala you were talking about, either direct unemployment disguised, giving the power of capital over workers. By taking away some of the stick of unemployment with an UBI that people could live on, maybe not well, it seems to me really could empower people for better jobs, for like volunteer labor, for dealing with reproductive labor, gender oppression, so that to me it can be part of the struggle, not in the main, but part of the struggle for transformation toward a socialist, participatory socialist society. So I would argue very much we see it in some of those values becoming part of the struggle, which we'll also need if we're going to transform this and other societies.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And Shakuntala?
Thank you, Antti, Peter, Jason, for helping me with the slides, and thank you, audience. Thank you very much for patiently listening. My closing, I'm very, very fortunate to be a part of this wonderful panel, and I would like to see real democracy, expanding democracy in this program, because we have this program, huge program, and there is immense scope of expanding participatory democracy. So expanding, emphasizing that, and expand, how do you create institutions to at that village level, strong institutions to, for a sustainable employment and for sustainable development. That should be the emphasis, and we need more and more forums doing that. And one of the, as you said, that yes, with the government now, we have that kind of right-wing government and lots of issues. And one of the major point of scraping this program is about the cost. The only thing is cost. And as I've mentioned, it's even with the neoliberal agenda, it's only less than 1% of GDP. So cost, it's a hyper way of making this cost a big issue. And then in the Indian context, unemployment rate, that number doesn't make much sense. What we need to look at, what is the employment to as a percentage of the labor force, and how do you increase that? And during the pandemic, that should be our main focus. It's not that unemployment is low or discouraged worker effect, none of that. That is not quite relevant in this context. So I'm very thankful to be a part of this forum, and hopefully we will be able to connect more in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, too. Thank you, too.
Fantastic. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for participating. And we'll end there. And enjoy the rest of the conference. Goodbye.
Goodbye.